in between. So you could see that what you're doing in the literature, your organizing frame here is to show the scope of the study and the varied perspectives that they could have on a continuum of possibilities. You're not making a contrast, you're not categorizing them into two separate groups, but what you're doing is you're organizing it to see the continuum, and then for the researcher to say, what preference on the continuum are you taking in your study? Note that this is the key point. It's not just the representation of the continuum. It's not just the description. It's to be able to say what's your preference in relation to that particular continuum. Another kind of argument might be it's not a series of opposites. And I think very often students tend to do this as binary opposites, good, bad, either in or out in the version of it. But what this is suggesting, and I'll just use 3, it could be 5, it could be 6, but that there are 3 main positions in the literature. So you're organizing the same set of literature, but you're organizing it in a form that organizes according to groupings and categorizations. Now, it might seem an obvious thing when you put it up in this particular diagrammatic way, but go through your own writings and start asking yourself, can we see the organizational frame of the literature review? Can we actually see how it is being set up? And in an orientation to your literature review, that's exactly what you should make explicit. I will, in this particular chapter, argue 3 positions with relationship to the way in which child abuse is managed. Firstly, as this, secondly, as that, thirdly, as that. The literature is going to be organized in these 3 categories, section 1, 2, and 3. Can you see? That's the orienting device that should be declared at the opening of your literature review, in the way in which you're organizing the framing or the framework, or another word to call it, the architecture of your argument. What's the plan that you're going to be looking at, the architecture of your argument, as you engage with what has been said before? That's essentially what a literature review is. What have others said about the phenomenon that you are studying? Of course, this might be probably more relevant in the social sciences, where they are not continuums, but they are sets of intersecting Venn diagrams. Now, it might be that you choose, when you're reading the literature, to start with a diagram like this, and then put in who are the researchers who take position 1, position 2, position 3, and where are the overlaps. Put the names of the individuals into your diagram, and then in your orienting section say, this is my structure. I'm going to be looking at first the 3 broad positions, and then the overlaps between the positions. And when you do this, I know in my own case, I don't start writing until I've drawn a map. Drawn a map because I'm a visual thinker, as you can obviously note, as I'm going along. All right? To think visually about the way in which you're organizing the literature frame. So here's another example. Another form could be, and this is all options that you could be using, and there are plenty more. If you go to Smart Graphics in Word, you'll see that there are many diagrams and possibilities like this, and you might want to see which one actually is more appropriate for your architecture of the argument. So this one here says, even though the 3 literature broad sections that I'm going to be using in the study are separate coffee beans, are separate parts, I am then going to grind it up and percolate it and put it through a funnel and I'm going to tell you this is my position. So I'm not going to stay with what is, I'm going to be moving towards creating a new lens. I'm not just going to stay within the existing frame of the particular lens. Okay, I want you just to think for a moment of your own literature study and see for yourself. Just take a moment to draw what you think would be a possible kind of figure to represent your literature. For a moment, just take a moment to say, what do you think would be your diagrammatic representation? I don't believe that it's going to be possible in this workshop for you to actually finalize it, but you can start the process to start organizing your thinking around what exactly that actually might mean for your own study. And I want to stress the point that not all of us are visual learners. Some might write it in the form of a set of bullets as an organizing frame. I'm just suggesting that if you're a visual learner, here's a good representation of what you're trying to do. Some of you might write 3 separate pages with 3 words, and you group things according to 3 words. So we learn and we think and we organize our thinking in different ways. And visual is one particular kind of way. Okay, I did alert you to smart graphics as a possibility. Remember, as you engage with any piece of writing throughout any literature argument, one needs to follow the SRC. Okay? Not the one in the campus here, the SRC. What's your statement? What is the proposition? What is the author actually saying? So you need to know, you can't get him wrong or her wrong, so you need to know the propositional content is accurately captured. So your first obligation in the literature is to understand the propositions and not misrepresent the proposition. But you also present a statement of your organizing of that proposition. It's not just telling us what the other said, but what is your viewpoint of what the other said. That's what we mean by make a statement about the literature that you're engaging with. And when I'm saying literature, it might be a group of books, a group of studies, or a group of authors, or even a single author. And start to ask yourself, what's the organizing device that you're going to be using? What statement do you want to make? That the dominant literature in the current situation is organized in a rather narrow behaviorist tradition. Okay, so you're making a statement, presenting a viewpoint, and then say the emphasis is on outward skills and demonstrated behaviors only in the nature of blah, blah, blah. I don't know your discipline, so I can't actually say exactly what that would mean. But you get what I mean by make a statement, the S. Then you have to offer a critique of it and present a reason for why you think this literature is good or that there's problematics with it. A gap. What's the link for your critique of the argument in this literature? what's the gap against the theorist or a gap in the theory. And then the often missing part in a literature review, which Brian will know when I say LTYS, means what has this got to do with your study, the link to your study. It's no use just telling me about all of the wonderful things that you've read, all the stones that get higher and higher. I want to know what purpose is this going to be serving for your study, the LTYS phenomenon. What's the link to your study? So if you don't follow the SRC, another way of following it is PEE, but I don't know whether people like that acronym, okay? But we're talking about learn to P, meaning present a proposition, present the evidence, and present an evaluation. So learn to P with the SRC. That's the proposition. Okay? That's how you go about developing your skills of being able to argue. So if you're making a proposition and not linking it back into where it's going into your study, you're just decorating the page. Because an academic researcher at the highest form of study is trying to say, what sense are you making of the world? What do the hens, the turtles, the doves mean to you? Note I added turtle in. Okay? All right. I'm going to suggest that we have to have absolute clarity, and this is usually the thing that a lot of people spend in the early stages. What is the phenomenon of your study? Meaning, what's the thing that's going under the microscope? What is it that you are going to be theorizing and developing an understanding of the phenomenon? Do you understand what the phenomenon that you are going to become the expert about? Because that's what you're doing in a PhD. You are trying to become an expert about a singular phenomenon, not the whole world, about this particular phenomenon. And you need to be having absolute clarity. What then are you choosing to focus on in that phenomenon? What's the specific aspect of the phenomenon that you are putting under the microscope? So the slide is there, the phenomenon. The microscope is looking with much more detail, depth, and focus on what is it, of all the possibility of things on the slide, what is it that you're going to be focusing on? So let's see what you're trying to do in the literature review. You're going to then organize that literature with a series of names, types of lovers, herbivores and carnivores. You with me? Those are the subheadings of your study. Because essentially, you should be saying to yourself, and which one am I going to give more weight to? Are there more carnivores or are there more herbivores? Okay? Where am I going to present the weighting? And a chapter for a literature review in a thesis in a PhD is about 20, 25 pages. You need to ask yourself, and of the 25 pages, how much are you going to be giving weight to the carnivores as opposed to the herbivores? Where are you putting the weight? Because your weighting is in relation to how you're going to be moving the argument of your literature. So therefore we're saying you need to establish how many concepts that you want to be establishing in your literature review. If it's 25 pages, how much are you going to go to concept 1, concept 2, or concept 3? You with me as you're following the analogy that we started off in the beginning of how you're organizing the way in which you're making sense of the world of the library or the possible knowledge that already exists in the field. That's what a reviewing of the literature means. You're viewing again, reviewing the literature. Okay? And then you say, in terms of that, what are the propositions that you want to come up to make about those 3 concepts? What do you want to say about herbivores or carnivores or types of lovers? etc. What is it that you want to say? So you can see that thinking must precede the writing. The organizing is more important, the organizing of the literature into boxes or different kinds of boxes. Then you could add in to say, and which authors or studies reinforce a particular proposition. And you could organize them to be able to say how they're going to link through. Now you can see how often the third column is what bad literature reviews normally do. They just list all the studies one after the other. And they expect the reader to make sense of the links between all of the parts of the literature. You can see what I'm suggesting is that you need to be looking at the left-hand side column before you start organizing the literature. Okay, is this making sense? Okay. Now, here's the LTYS situation. Is in telling each of the stories of the propositions, you need to make a move which suggests what's the gap. What is it that they do cover and what do they not cover? What about that phenomenon that you're looking at in the current propositions, in the current literature, is not understood or poorly understood or is not dealt with at all? That's what we call the mind the gap issue. Are you paying attention to what's the thing you're trying to cross over, to move into, to be able to say what they are not able to do? Identifying the gaps. And they don't always need to be a whole range of gaps, but they usually are of three types. The one type is, it is a contextual gap, meaning that this study has not been done in this circumstance, in the South African context, in the higher education context, in the context of looking at children. It's all been done about adults, but not children. You can see it's a contextual gap. So what you're trying to show here is, in the literature, in what we're surveying, what do we not see that is contextually relevant? Now in South Africa that's useful and easy because there's often studies that have been done a whole lot of other places but have not been done in the South African context. And therefore what you're doing is you're filling the gap contextually. But a PhD study is not just a contextual gap. It's a methodological gap as well. The second gap that you are trying to be working through is CTM, is the context, theory, and methodology. So remember tiling, right? CTM, all right? So we've got a contextual gap, the second is a methodological gap, and the third is a theoretical gap. Now what do I mean by a methodological gap? Most of the studies have followed a survey methodology to be able to research this phenomenon. Or the research is dominated only by case studies. Can you see? It's saying by looking at the literature, the gap is methodological as well. And then the last one is it's theoretical. It's missing an understanding of some part that should be taken consideration of. Not contextual or methodological, but something theoretically. It's not dealing with some aspect of growth or development or professionalism or something that's missing theoretically or philosophically. Okay? And so you can see the way in which the literature is being assessed is being able to say we know the propositions, we know how they can be organized, we know what is limited in the literature, we know what's the gap, and therefore we're going to link it into your study. So we must be seeing the LTYS in the literature review. And all of that has to be done in 25 pages. So you can see it's quite a skill to be able to do a literature review. Okay, I'm going to move on quickly to be talking about how do we develop understanding. Okay, all right. So we're looking here at drawing on a range of different people who have contributed to the development of these slides. But I want to talk about, first of all, how you assess a theoretical framework, how you assess a literature review, and then can they be combined? Those are the 3 points that I want to take us to a break. Okay, firstly, we need to be looking at a theoretical framework. If you're introducing theories in much the same way as we said you were introducing ideas for literature review, we might ask ourselves the question, why are you including certain literature or certain theories? It's not there just for decoration. Do you understand its assumptions and its beliefs? How are they linked theoretically? And what are the values that this literature embeds? By the way, I see some of you furiously taking notes. I'll send this to Given, and Given can circulate this to you as a source to look at in much more depth. Is that okay, Given? All right? And so if you just want to take notes to ask questions or comments or things that you might find useful, otherwise it's impossible to take all of this down. All right? You might want to ask the question, are you justifying what you're including? Is it linked to the phenomenon that you study? Can you see, I'm just summarizing all the things that I've said above in the earlier presentation. Are you dealing with compatible theories, theories that can sit alongside of each other? How exactly are you going to be using the theory is the important issue. Is the selected theory explaining the context? Is it that you're going to elaborate it for the South African context? Is it that you're going to present new data in relation to that particular context? Is it that your intention of talking about this theory is to say how valuable it is? I think that's a problematic one, because often people end up in advocacy mode. All right? They're building the wall higher and higher and higher. Okay, they're trying to advocate their own position rather than present a range of positions out of which a selection is made. It's also another way of looking at the literature is to understand the literature as a lens or a guide. And note that in a PhD, the intention is not simply to push back the C and the M, the context and the methodology. The important issue of why you get a PH, philosophy, doctorate of philosophy, is because you are generating a philosophy, a theoretical insight. That's what a PhD is, as opposed to a methodological insight or a contextual insight. And that's why it's regarded as the highest form of study, because it's the highest level of abstract thinking in the organizing of the existing knowledge. That's why you're given a red gown, okay, to stand out from everybody else, okay? Because you are aiming to say that you can add ministry to philosophize, to theorize the world, in the world. Okay, that's why it's in red, okay? Note that you need to be talking about rival theories. It's not just advocacy. If you're leaving things out, tell us carefully why you're leaving them out, because there's reasons for it, and therefore you can see the parable of is very important as a metaphor. Here's one way of putting theories alongside each other. You with me now in terms of this diagram. You can put it in another way to say how the theories have changed over time. It used to be like this, it moved to that. So you're doing a chronological sequence in the organizing. This is another form of organizing theories. You might say how it has evolved. Evolved meaning getting better, as responsive to the context, making selections and refinements and evolution as we see as it moves. And therefore your argument of how you present the theoretical framework will be in that particular way, to be able to see that evolution. So the important thing in the writing will be to explain the evolution. It could be a continuum, as I said. It could be a percolation. It could be an accumulation, bringing two things together to establish a new. It could be an interlinking, how one affects the other one, affects the other one, in what might be called geared up thinking. So theory 1 pushes theory 2, which assists to move theory 3. So they're not oppositional. They're complementary and therefore can be seen as a whole. That's why you can see the architecture of your argument is so important. You've got to know what the architecture is as you're engaging with it. All right? I'm going to skip conceptual framework unless anyone's really interested in what's the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework, and go to instead trying to think through. Please don't write boring headings to the chapters. This is my literature review, okay, and we call it the literature review. Because you have the architecture, you know what arguments you're leading. So think of a sexy title. Think of a title that's going to suggest what is the argument of, or the architecture that you are aiming to present. We'd rather know that you talk about herbivores and carnivores rather than hens, chickens, and all the lot. You with me? In terms of the way in which you organize it. Show that you know where you're going in the goal of your research. Organize the chapter. Send out an orientation to what you're aiming to achieve in the orientation for your chapter, and tell us how you're going to organize it. You can see, and there are different kinds of organization. It could be, I'm going to organize the literature to draw a distinction between the national and the international literature and the local literature, drawing a contrast between those three levels. That's one way of organizing the literature. There isn't a single way of how to organize the literature. It's how is it best making the point that you wish to make about the study in order to set up your study. It could be I want to look at first the Asian, then the Australian, then the African, then the American, then the Anglophone. Now can you see I'm deliberately doing this? Most literature in South African theses starts the international, and they mean, by the way, international, whom? Europe and the West, okay? And in Africa, this is how we're doing it. Can you see? You are making a point about the way in which you're organizing the literature politically if you organize it in that particular way. So be conscious on the hidden messages that you're signaling in relation to how you organize the literature. Note how most of our literature in South Africa is only Anglophone. We know very little about French theorists except if they translate it. Okay? So you can see there's a gap here. If you were studying in France, you'll have a different opinion about the same phenomenon because you are located in a language that reads the world in a particular way. Okay? So you can see there are many ways in which you could contextually organize your literature. An easy way is chronological. We can say in the first decade of the research, this is how it was dominated by these following considerations. And we see a recurrence of these patterns. This era might be called the psychomotor development phase. I don't know, whatever you might choose. What is an organizational phrase in terms of eras or decades? Another way to organize it, this is the literature pre-independence in South Africa, this is the literature post-apartheid. Okay? This is pre-World War I, this is post-World War I. Or this is the period between World War I and World War II. If that is relevant to showing that there are markers that made a significant moment, and you can create your own markers. The markers as you read the literature. So you might want to say, I want to look at the literature and organize the literature, and I think a turning point is 1976, when the issue of language education became disrupted by the Soweto uprising. You with me? You can create the markers in organizing the framing. Okay. Another one would be conceptually generating the broad arguments. You say, I want to look at first this concept, then that concept, then that concept. Conceptual categories that you might organize.